The Lord bless you today. I'm just out and about having some time with the Lord, and I felt God placed something on my heart that I felt was right to share. Most people will know King David in the Bible. He was a really famous king, one of the greatest kings Israel had ever had. He'd had great promises on his life from God, and God had used him in mighty ways, but David came to a place in life where he made some really bad choices. He made some huge mistakes. He had an affair. He had a man killed. And this one day, Nathan the prophet comes to him and he explains the errors of David's ways to him. And David sees more greatly the mistake that he has made, the things that he's done wrong. And so he confesses it. He confesses his sin before God, and Nathan the prophet says, God's forgiven you. And so what we have a timeline of David being used by God miraculously, and then he makes this huge mistake and he falls. And then he puts things back right with God again. And after this huge mistake, the biggest mistake David ever makes in his life, after this mistake, after God has forgiven him from it, he then receives his greatest blessing. Because after this event, he then has his son Solomon. And as many may or may not know, Solomon is in the lineage of Jesus Christ. It was one of the promises that was on David's life, that through his seed, the Messiah would come. And so what you have David living for God, doing what was right, God using him. David makes this huge mistake, massive mistake, falls, does wrong, puts it back right with God again. God forgives him. And then after this event, after that's all took place, God then blesses him and uses him in his greatest act yet, that he would allow David to be part of the lineage of the Messiah, of Jesus Christ. And what that would say to me today, and I hope it touches hearts today, is that you may have been walking with the Lord. You may have known God well, but you've done some stuff, you've fallen, you've made some huge mistakes. And God is saying, come back to me, I will forgive you. Confess your sin, put it right before God, and move on in the things of God. Because just because you've made some mistakes, God can still use you. David's greatest blessing was still on the other side of being forgiven. His greatest blessing was still on the other side. That although he had made some big mistakes, he came before God, he humbled himself before God, put it right, and then he moved on into his greatest blessing. And so I would suggest, let that be an example to you today. If you've made some big mistakes in your past, lay it down before the foot of the cross and move on into what God has for you. Just because you've made some big mistakes does not mean God has given up on you. He doesn't leave anybody on the shelf. He has no spare books. He wants to use you. And so your greatest blessing can still be ahead of you despite what you may have done in the past. Because God is a God of grace. And the reality is, it was only by the grace of God that David saw that happen in his life. We can only do anything in ministry because of the grace of God. David had no way of orchestrating Samuel being in the lineage of Jesus Christ. That was a total thing from God, a total act from God, that God took David and used David, and to the point that he is in the lineage, him and his son Solomon are in the lineage of Jesus Christ the Messiah, the one who would come into this world, who would die upon the cross, would rise 3 days later again, so that we could have relationship with him, so that we could know God. The Lord bless you today.